Welcome to Cow Talks. I'm Chris Pravat, Beef Cattle and Forage Commodity Director for the Alabama Farmers Federation.
And I am Marcelo Valau, Forage Extension Specialist with the University of Florida.
And this is our podcast, where we dive deep into the main topics affecting livestock and forage production in the southeastern United States.
From the mainstream media to new technologies straight from our research stations.
From cattle prices to international trade.
From our pastures and beyond.
Join us on this journey as we tackle the main issues affecting our producers and the sustainability of our production systems.
Our episode today is a little bit different. Instead of an interview, we're bringing to you some of the presentations of the 75th Beef Cattle Short Course, put together by the University of Florida Animal Science Department. Today, Dr. Lynn Sollenberger, distinguished professor in agronomy, and a frequent guest of this podcast and other podcasts that our team produces, is talking a little bit about his 40 years of research and extension at the University of Florida. Dr. Sollenberger retires this summer, and he's leaving a huge legacy, ingrained in many of us that continue his work and apply his knowledge in the field. To share a little bit more with our audience of his impact with producers, join us in listening to the presentation that Dr. Sollenberger gave at this Beef Cattle Short Course. I hope you enjoy.
Thanks very much, everybody. It's great to have this opportunity. So, as Todd indicated, he asked me to address this subject, 4 years of forage research at the University of Florida. There's a reason why he asked me to address that specific number of years, because in 1985, it looks like it must have been a pretty stressful job. This is one of those talks where you could take a bunch of different directions, and so I wasn't quite sure how to handle this one. So I gave it some thought, and one possibility was to kind of give you this long list of these things that the forage group has done over this time period. But that seemed really quite boring and not really what I wanted to do. So what I chose to do is to select a group of stories, and there are 5 of them, but these are stories of what I consider to be long-term successful efforts of the U.S. IFAS forage team, and specifically ones that led to progress in Florida forage livestock industries. I want to highlight just 2 quick things there. One, long-term. Forages are perennial plants, and we typically cannot make a lot of big progress in a short period of time. So to have a successful forage program, you need to have this group of people representing a number of disciplines working together over an extended period of time to make some progress. Second, the word group or team is very important in this context. One of the reasons why the forage group at Florida, I think, I'm biased, has been successful has been the ability of the industry, of our administrators, of our state government to sustain a core forage team. And that IFAS forage team, I think, has reaped some benefits for the industry at large. We'll talk about those. All right, so stories. I'm going to tell 5 stories. They'll be varying lengths. There'll be some short stories, no novels. But we're going to talk about grazed forage for the cool season, year-round forage systems, a little bit about legumes, the pasture decline, and understanding grazing management. And again, these are areas where, in my mind, I can see over this 30-year period some significant progress. Story number 1, grazed forage for the cool season. So let's start by setting the stage of kind of the basic system. And that is a system that's based on perennial warm season grass, Bahia grass. Now, one of the challenges that we face with Bahia grass is seasonality of production. We don't need to tell you that it's highly concentrated during the warm season, and we have some gaps. So those are significant challenges that we need to think about within this context. So the question then that I'd like to talk about with you is, can we provide fresh forage in the cool season? What are the possible answers to that question? Well, one of those possible answers is cool season forages. So let's talk about those for just a bit. The added or overseeded rye-rye-rust mixtures onto that Bahia grass pasture. And what that's done is mainly the main benefit you can see is concentrated in the spring. So those plants are very productive late winter through spring and can address some of that forage gap during that time of the year. Minimal effect in the fall. So, cool season annual forages? Yeah, good answer, particularly from north and northwest Florida, more so than the south. And then there's a couple of things relative to some of the progress that's been made. My plant breeding colleagues in agronomy have released over 30 annual ryegrass varieties. And I really didn't know this, but they're planted on over 1.1 million acres in the Southeast U.S. On an annual basis. They've also released a bunch of small grains and forage legumes, particularly clovers. But we need to keep in mind that with annuals, they do need to be, for the most part, replanted every year. That comes at a significant expense. And every time you have to plant something, there is a risk of failure. So this is a good answer, but it does have some shortcomings. Ideally, I was told when I came here, Lynn, if you can develop a cool season perennial forage, you'll be famous. Fail. Maybe I'm now infamous, so I'm not sure. One forage that was mentioned was tall fescue. And it brings the seeded rows of tall fescue into a Bermuda grass sod. And this is kind of the ideal scenario, not with tall fescue or some other grass, but when you're out of perennial grass, that when the warm season grass goes dormant, the cool season grass starts to grow, the cool season grass goes out in the spring, the warm season grass comes year after year. That would be the ideal. Our forage group has looked at a different tall fescue lines, some other cool season grasses, and the problem has been that these forages have failed to survive summer. Competition from vigorous warm season grasses, diseases, anything you can think of, but we have not been able to crack that difficult biological puzzle. So, there are options. So if we think about this, if a heat-tolerant cool season perennial, like tall fescue perhaps, does not exist, and we haven't found it yet, what about we flip that and look for a cold-tolerant warm season perennial? And indeed, that plant has been developed and evolved a lot over these last 4 decades. Limpo grass, some of you know it as Marthria. It's a warm season grass. It's most productive during the warm season. That big a basin, right? From November in Mariana. And so, in fact, this plant has some interesting characteristics. So let's think about what it brings to the table. And it has a number of interesting traits, but what I consider to be the most important are these two. One, it is productive during short days, particularly in the fall. Days get shorter. And that's a time when Bahia grass and Bermuda grass are getting ready for winter. They're about ready to go dormant. The other characteristic is that it will tolerate a light frost. And it's going to regrow pretty rapidly after that light frost if the weather conditions permit. And it's very useful in South Florida where, 1 or 2 frosts a winter may be kind of the max of what you're looking at. When I'm talking to my undergraduate class, I try to give them some points of reference, and I refer to limpo grass as a party animal. Where is that coming from, right? So our grasses like Bahia grass and Bermuda grass, they're pretty conservative. When fall's coming, they're kind of like a squirrel, right? Squirrels putting away nuts. They're putting away stored energy below ground. Limpo grass, not so much. It's going to have a good time. If the temperature is right, if the soil moisture is there, if there are nutrients there, it's going to grow. And we can capitalize on that characteristic of limpo grass. One of the other things that limpo grass brings to the table is that it is relatively high in digestibility, and that digestibility decreases more as it matures than most other perennial grasses. Let's take a look at that quickly. This is looking at digestibility. You can see digit grass, you may know it as Pangola, limpo grass, and Bahia grass. So, looking at maturities of 2, 4, 8, and 12 weeks. If you look specifically where the arrows are, you can see Bahia grass is consistently lower in digestibility than limpo grass, but that difference is particularly magnified at mature growth stages, where limpo grass may be 15 to 17 units greater in digestibility than Bahia grass. So what does that do for us? That makes a beautiful fit for a stockpiling system. Let's talk about that a little bit. We'll get to that in just a minute when we look at the systems. All right, so what are the outcomes then of this limpo grass work? When I came, there was some limpo grass around, but not a lot. And now we estimate about 400,000 acres of limbo grass in the state of Florida. Annual value, my colleague Dr. Van from ONA indicated about $40 million per year to the cattle industry in savings on winter feed costs associated with use of limbo grass. Some of the recent advantages, many of you probably aware, the newer varieties, Kentucky Kenhigh, and they're superior to the previous used variety, Floral. Okay, so that's a story about the cool season and some advances that have addressed the gaps that exist. I'm going to reinforce that a bit with this conversation about year-round forage systems. All right, so you've seen this before, you know about these gaps in production. And so let's think about the North and South Florida in terms of how we fit forages into systems to deal with those gaps. All right, North Florida first. So it's going to all start with a perennial warm season grass, right? And so we're going to pick the head grass the most common. Now, one opportunity we can see based on that ability of limbo grass to be a part of the into the and also the slow decline in digestibility is that it can fill a lot of that fall forage gap with stockpiled limbo. In North Florida, typically overseeding by head grass with cool season forages, so some grains make a little bit of contribution in the farm, but the big contribution then is going to be in the early part of winter through early spring. We can add ryegrass and clovers, again, cool season forages to fill that gap, after some climbed warm season legumes during the summer season. This is a North system that takes advantage of all the new varieties of ryegrass, small grains, clovers, and also limbo grass to plug in to that system based on the hair grass to compose what is a year-round forage system. All right, let's move south. So in South Florida, let's start with the hair grass again. Stockpile limbo grass fits there as well. Many fewer cool season forages, typically brown. Some annual ryegrass. You can see maybe we can fit a part of that cool season gap both fall and spring. So not only stockpiling, but that plant has the ability to bounce back after a cold snap and produce a significant amount of green forage that can be grazed during winter. And then we can add the legumes into that system as well. That was a short story. Okay, number 3. Let's talk about legumes a little bit. And the issue that I'm going to focus on here is legume persistence. Conventional wisdom tells us that warm climate legumes, those that are adapted to summer in Florida, are not persistent and they cannot compete with our warm season perennial grasses, the Bahias and Bermudas of the world. That's conventional wisdom. However, during this 40-year period, there has been a lot of progress with perennial peanut, rhizoma. It was lived in terms of decades. I'll give you some numbers in a minute. A very high value hay crop, and again, some rough estimates contributing over $20 million to the forage livestock systems in the state on an annual basis. Now, you say, how can we be sure that rhizoma peanut can persist for a long period of time? I was there. So in 1983, as a new graduate student who had never planted anything using other than seeds, we planted perennial peanut pastures at the beacon. And my last graduate student, who graduated in December of 24, utilized those same pastures with that same original planting date 30 plus years later. So, management, and it survived. Now, the story about peanut is a mixed one because there are still challenges that we need to work on. So there are a few issues for the next 40 years to be dealt with. One of them is high cost of planting. Because my goal, and what I've been working a lot of the last 10 years, has been to move grain peanut from being that high value hay crop. That's great for the producer, but I also would like to see it as a component of the hairgrass pastures so that we can forget about nitrogen fertilizer forever. Okay, that's my goal. We're not there yet. So what we need, I think, going forward is some effective management for sod seeding into the hairgrass that reduces establishment costs. We're working on it. I think we'll get there. So the last part then of this story that I'd like to mention or talk about with you is this question: how much legume we need? We did some comparisons of different proportions of legumes in pastures and compared it with behavior grass with no nitrogen fertilizer. That's a very common management in Florida. So what did we find? If there was only 10% peanut in the mixture, we increased animal daily gain by 40%. If we had as much as 35% peanut, we doubled yearly gains. 2 years of data, those are the numbers, 0.64 to 1.32, and gain per acre from 140 to 310. So in Florida, we have demonstrated that we do have some legume options that are persistent, that they can make a major impact in animal performance when present in small quantities. And what we really focus on going forward is economical establishment programs to get them into more grass acres throughout the state of Florida. All right, story 4. Meridian behavior grass pasture decline. So you all know behavior grass, most widely used perennial in Florida, very persistent. Doesn't matter that much about the drainage, doesn't like standing water per se, but it'll tolerate it for a while. Tolerates a wide range of grazing and fertilization practices. Being from the north originally, I can make Yankee jokes, okay? And so, I tell my students that behavior grass is like a Yankee. As long as it's in Florida, it's happy. So that's the deal. Okay, even my students are in the room, they say, yeah, I've heard that joke about 5 times. Okay, so let's take a little bit of a historical perspective in terms of behavior grass. So prior to the Middle East, so we're going back to about the time that I arrived in Florida, most behavior grass pastures received a complete fertilizer: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. However, there was that issue that only those of you who have little grain might remember, that arable embargoes and increasing gas prices have drove up costs of fertilizer and so on. But because of increasing fertilizer costs, the producers simply decided they can't afford those recommended rates. So they were applying some fertilizer with much less than that lower recommended rate, including some P&K. I'm going to interrupt this story for a little bit here. Okay? So we're going to go back in to put the undergraduate teacher hat on for just a moment. All right, we're going to talk about barrel and staves. For those of you who aren't interested in barrel and staves, think about bourbon. Okay, so what are those? In Kentucky, they use these barrels with wooden staves to put their bourbon in to let it age. I'm not a bourbon producer, so I don't know how that works. Anyway, that's what they do. So that's the example we're looking at. In this particular case, the barrel, we're going to say, for this audience, it's water in there. Okay, that's water. And the height of the stave is a resource that is used to produce plant growth. Now, our illustration then moves from water to plant yield. So the height of the plant yield in the barrel is a function of the shortest stave. The shortest stave puts the ceiling on how much the plant can grow. What is that shortest stave? Almost always in our pastures, it is nitrogen. So it doesn't matter if we add potassium and phosphorus. If nitrogen is most limiting, we're going to get a yield response. So that's the point we need to develop. Back to our story. So if we move to the early 1990s, farm behavior pastures, clearly nitrogen was most limiting nutrient. Producers were reducing the amount of nitrogen they were applying. So it was still the most limiting nutrient, even after applying some nitrogen. And so often there was no effect in that case of applying P&K. And this was actually confirmed with something called the 9-County Project that was really extension research driven, that showed that on producer pastures, typically at that point, adding P&K did not have a yield response. So it became clear to that there needed to be a change in terms of fertilizer recommendations. So instead of normal recommended nitrogen rate, they came up with 3. And so the producer chooses whether they're going to go low or high with nitrogen. And depending on that choice, that's going to have an effect on whether nitrogen remains the most limiting nutrient and whether you're going to see a response to. So for example, the low end is applying 50 pounds of N per acre. And that recognizes in that case that even with those 50 pounds, nitrogen is still likely to be the most limiting nutrient. Generally in that case, P&K are not going to generate a response. But at Hamlin, 1995. Of his overall recommendations, he said, if you follow this practice for more than 1 year, then you need to then think about applying P&K every third or fourth year to avoid excessive depletion. Producers were very interested in not buying P&K. That was an easy sell. Some of the things we're selling, you guys look at it, not it. Applying less fertilizer, I can go for that one, right? Particularly if it's not giving me a yield response. But the problem can be if we get into a habit of doing something and don't keep in mind the longer term impact. So this is behavioral pasture decline. What do you do when you have a problem, right? The task force. So I chose the task force, so I can't be too hard on the task force. But we listened to producers to find out how large the problem was and what the nature of it was. There was a pasture task force appointed in 2013, and then a survey that took Extension County faculty to many producers and looked at their system, what issues they were having, had some data on soil tests and fertilization, and so on. All right, so what did we find? Well, most of the pastures where behavioral decline was being observed were greater than 10 years old. 3/4 of them were greater than 15 years old. So they were typically older pastures. We also found that about 2/3 of them had soil pH that was below the target for maize grass. About 2/3 of them had soil care that was below what would be considered recommended. 3/4 of them had either low P or low K. So it was about that time that the Fertile Cattle Enhancement Fund came into being. And so we were able to secure some of those funds. And based on some recommendations from county extension faculty and so on, we did some on-farm studies. So we investigated trials at 4 ranches, and they were managed as a producer normally managed them, with the exception that we applied the lineman fertilizer according to the treatments that we had set up. So just to give you some idea of what those ranches look like in terms of location and then soil characteristics. Soil pH average 4.94. P&K, both very low. So what we find when we started looking at different combinations of liming and adding of these nutrients? Well, we increased yield by about 18%, around 20% with potassium fertilization. What's that tell us? That tells us that potassium is now a limited nutrient, right? After all those years. I say in 6 of 8 site years. Let me just explain that quickly. So we have 4 locations. We evaluated each of them in 2 years. 2 times 4 equals 8 site years. So 6 of those 8 showed about a 20% increase in K and in yield due to K. Cover also increased in a number of those settings. Liming increased forage production in about half of the locations, P in only 1 site year. So what's the conclusion then? Not liming and providing key nutrients, particularly potassium, since the mid-1990s. So these folks were all on board with not applying P&K, but, 15 years is a long time not to be dealing with soil pH and decreased performance of the grass, and likely an important piece in terms of pasture decline. One quick point, the hair grass may not be the nutrient issue that kills it. It may be cricket or maybe something else, but we make it more vulnerable to those kinds of issues. So what now? What do we recommend? We recommend regular soil testing. I would say about every 3rd year. Track the need for lime P&K. We know that N is often the most limiting nutrient, but if we wait too long in terms of replenishing P&K, we're going to have problems. All right, last one. 4-5, understanding grazing management based on plant growth time. So what we're looking at is following the foliation event, be that grazing or cutting. What does the root growth of that grass look like if we're not foliating it over a period of time? So how much mass, quantity, whatever you want to call that, accumulating time, and what does the shape of that curve look? So we talk about 4 phases for that curve. Ag, linear, plateau. So in the ag phase, immediately following the foliation event, limited leaf area, slow growth. We go out of that to the plateau stage. We have a more mature plant and some other issues going on. Let's compare banana grass and this stemmy grass. You can call it Bermuda grass or whatever you start with, whatever you want to call it. Notice the bluegrass. Let's just say that's our cutting height that we propose. What you can see, there's still a lot of leaf. remaining, right? Okay. However, a new upright growing stemming plant, not much leaf remaining. And so we've got some very different kinds of situations going on in terms of regrowth. For the hair grass, even right after the defoliation event, that leaf puts us kind of at the bottom of that linear growth phase. So the plant's already able to regrow pretty quickly following a grazing event. However, that taller stemming grass, when we cut it or graze it heavily, we're down in that loud phase. And it's going to just sit there for a little while because it's busy trying to create movement, but that takes some time. Okay. We go through that linear growth phase where everything's cranking on cylinders. And then the question is what happens at the top? Basically, we say we should be grazing or cutting, because if we wait after that, the plant's getting more mature and losing nutrient value, but we're not getting significantly more yield. So then what causes that plateau? Well, basically the upper leaves in the plant are to shade the lower leaves. You still want to be fed, but they're not ready to milk because they're trying to photosynthesize in a shaded environment. They're not very productive, but they still need to be fed, and that's a drag on the net productivity. We think about when that occurs for different kinds of plants. For a plant like the hair grass, it's low growing, it's a few upright stems and floppy leaves. That means it shades sooner. So what's that tell us? With that type of plant, we're a regrowth interval before we get to a harvest period. Whereas that upright growing plant, it's going to take it a longer period of time to get to that stage. Plus, notice if you look at that plant, it's not doing nearly as much self-shading, and it's able to keep growing for a longer period of time. Okay, let's get to a take-home. Growth habit and stocking rate, in other words, estimate how close we graze, is going to determine how much leaf area remains after defoliation event. And that amount of leaf area is going to determine how quickly that plant regrows. Okay? So if you're looking for a quick bounce back after a defoliation event, a lot of it is going to be a function of how much leaf tissue is remaining when you move animals or get your hay harvest material. When the plant begins to self-shade, that determines when that plateau hits, and that tells us when we need to be thinking about harvesting. Last question. Does this curve help to explain differences between rotationally and continuously grazed pasture? It does, actually. So with rotational grazing, plants end up in that linear growth phase for a greater proportion of the grazing season. Right? And what we find then is that faster average growth rates results in about a 30% higher forage production under rotational than continuous grazing. Do we need to rotational graze everything? Is rotational grazing like mom-sliced bread and apple pie? Not really. We can use either rotational or continuous from many types of plants, particularly something like the hair grass, but recognizing that there is some benefit into rotational grazing in terms of kind of a yield benefit associated with it. All right, wrap up on grazing management. That's a short growth habit, closer to the soil surface. Burial grass. And we often graze closer and regrow faster, self-shade sooner, and require more frequent defoliation. Rotational grazing, not required for all plants, but it does increase growth rate. It decreases spot grazing, which increases the overall grazing efficiency, meaning a greater percentage of the forage produced is actually going to go in that animal mouth than under continuous. And those two together result in about a 30% increase in pasture carrying capacity. Conclusion. You're almost there. Hang in there. All right. So investment in forage research return. Wide range of inclusions in forages to fill that winter spring gap in North Florida, all of it with ryegrass, small grain, clovers, so on. Introduction and improvement of liver grass for stockpile forage in the fall and south, and for winter grazing in the south. Increased availability are considered a persistent legume, which we didn't know existed. Anyway, knowledge of how to better manage nutrients to avoid behavior pasture decline, and a better understanding of why different forages respond differently to grazing, and then how we can utilize them most efficiently. So these guys are looking for something. I think it's for new adoption. So that's the challenge that we leave behind for the next 4 years. There's still work to be done. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and also recognize Florida Cattle Enhancement Board to go check off programs for funding a lot of our research over these years. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for joining us on this Cow Talks podcast. We hope you have enjoyed this conversation.
If you have any questions, ideas, follow-ups, or comments, please reach out to us through our email, forages@ifas.ufl.edu. That is forages@ifas.ufl.edu, or find us on our social media, uf.forages on Instagram, UF Forage Team on Facebook, or UF IFAS Forages on YouTube. Cow Talk Podcast was brought to you by the University of Florida Forage Team with technical support from the University of Florida College of Agriculture and Life Sciences Faculty Instructional Resource and Support Team. This episode was produced by Marcelo Valal, Olivia Maule, and Ashley Kanabrowski.